the same time. That's how close it is. Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, stuff started.
So, it's, but the bad part is last year, the two lower band weekends, we actually had decent moonrise. It was like 7, 8 p.m.
Yep.
This coming year, I think it's the very last weekend when it's the least amount of activity is 8 p.m. or something. The rest of them are all 10, 10:30. And unfortunately on the microwave bands in August and September, I got to deal with leaves on trees, so I got to get 30 degrees elevation, which is like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So
that tower on the left, is that 25 or 45?
everything is 25 except for this one.
That's the
45.
And then I'm just gonna look at this one close,
Yep.
because obviously the one on the left's guide, because I don't see the.
Yeah, the two big towers are both guide.
Oh, I see. Here.
Up there and then down about there. Yeah. That was the first tower that went up. That's where 6 and 2 and HF is.
Yep.
And then the VHF 222 through 3.4 gig is on the one right behind the house. That was where,
These guys here?
yeah, that was where I originally was going to put my first boom bounce array.
Yeah.
The problem I ran into, I took all the stuff off of there and I dropped the thing down to 30 feet, so it was high enough that I could clear the roof.
Right.
The problem that we ran into when we tried to put it up there was we could not figure out how to get the whole assembled unit in one piece around the edge of the roof. And if we tried to put it together in piece by piece up on the roof, it was too high above the roof, so I couldn't get to it. So we tried doing it and we gave up and I scrapped it, and then I ended up getting parts and putting up that second tower, or the first one that's in the garden there. That was back in '93.
So the beam on the bottom with the traps on it, that's not the 6.
Which one are you talking about?
Well, the tower on the left.
The big tower?
Yeah,
that's a tri-bander for
Tri-bander,
HF.
okay.
It's an
So the 6 meter one is in the middle.
It's in the middle.
Yeah, and then the one on top would be 2 meters.
That's 2 meters.
Yeah, okay.
2 meter sideband.
Should we get started?
If you're ready, we can.
Yep. Charlie Betz, his third presentation on EME, and not known yet to be the last, but
Well, it's going to be. I'm going to warn you that it's ended up being fairly long, so if we just, I'm going to try and hold it to an hour, and we'll probably cut it off there, or if we get to the very end, it's a lot of pictures of various different dishes and arrays of other people, which we can zoom through pretty quick. But tonight what I want to talk about, like I said here, it's the third time. The first one was more on the physics and stuff behind the moon orbit and everything, and all the things you have to deal with. The second one was on the equipment. Tonight what I want to focus on more is on how I got involved in my station and some of the stuff I've done, and try to give you an example of what can actually be done. Okay. One thing I want to bring up right away, last time I was here, somebody asked me at the end, it's like, well, you know, do you just figure out all this stuff on your own, or do you have help? And the answer to that is it's kind of a combination. You know, you get stuck. There's probably nobody or very few people that just dive into EME with no other weak signal experience. So you learn how all that stuff works, and then EME becomes more of a mechanical challenge really than anything. So some of it was things that you could figure out. A lot of it was you talk to guys who have actively done this and get ideas. And then the third thing, there's a bunch of different conferences. There's a bunch of groups that are dedicated to weak signal work. There's 3 or 4 of those in the U.S. The Central States VHF Society is the one I belong to. It covers most of the central states of the U.S. and they have a conference every year where they get together with all guys that are working weak signal VHF, and there's a fair number of EME guys there. This last summer was the first time that I was able to attend one of the international EME conferences. It was held in Trenton, New Jersey back in early August. This is an international conference, so it moves all over the world. And this was the first time since about 2010 that it had been in the U.S. And I decided I better go because I might not get another chance. And that was a blast. Because everybody that's there is EME guys. We had There was probably about 140 attendees, and about 20% of that was DX guys. You know, there was 3 guys from Czechoslovakia, or not the Czech Republic. There was a couple of guys from Australia, a bunch of people from across other parts of Europe. So it was really good, a lot of fun, and there's a lot of presentations. I actually gave one there myself. And you'll learn so much stuff doing this, and you get to share your experiences and, you know, what works, what doesn't. So that's a big piece of learning how to do this stuff. Okay, so I guess the big question is, well, why would you want to use EME? Well, first of all, you know, if you're looking for a challenge, there's probably very few things in amateur radio that are more challenging than this. I mean, it is challenging. As I said, you find out it mostly becomes mechanical issues more than anything. That, and then figuring out how to reduce losses. And trust me, it gets very frustrating at times, but when you get stuff working, it's very, very rewarding. Okay. You know, there's other reasons why you would do it, and one of them is worked all states, and that was really what got me going. I'd been in weak signal VHF for about 5 years, 5 or 6. I was on 2 meters for about 5 years at that point. I think I started in about '88, and over the years I got a little bit better equipment and amplifiers, better antennas. I was, I think, running an amp that would do about 600 to 800 watts, and I had that big antenna up on the tower that you saw, that 17 element. And from the start in '88 through early '93, I actually managed to work 35 states on 2 meters on various modes. Okay, and EME was not one of them at that point. Okay, and just to give you some idea, worked all states on the VHF bands is actually fairly rare. 2 meters, right now, and this is as of last year, that's as current as the ARRL's website is. And I know some of these numbers have changed since then, but they list 242 worked all states on 2 meters. I was number 147. What I've listed there is the station that got the first worked all states on those bands in the year it happened. 222 had 10 up until about 4 years ago. You know, back in the 70s, it was a big push to see who could be the first one to work all states on some of these VHF bands. In 1973, it happened on 2 meters. 222 was the last of that. Part of that is because it's a much smaller group. 222 and 902 are not bands anywhere other than Region 2. And all these other bands have a lot of Europeans on. They really kind of drive it. 222 and 902 are pretty much limited to Canada and the US and maybe a few Caribbean countries. There was a group of about 15 people back in the 70s and 80s that were pushing 222. The first one was in '83, and there was a total of 10 by '87, and that was about the time we lost the lower 2 megahertz of the band, and all the activity just dried up until about 2018 or so. It kind of got revived. You'll notice that 902 was just, the first one was issued 2 years ago. I missed giving LUA his last state. Wisconsin was his last state on 902, and I was struggling to try and get stuff working. And one of the Rover stations came up and gave it to him. He also was the first on 1296. Up until about 3-4 years ago, there were 2 issued on 1296. You're going to hear about a Rover. He was involved in every single one of them that was given out since then, putting out states. None of the bands above 1296 have been conquered yet. W5LUA tells me he has 39 on 2304. So likely he's going to be the first one to do it. Probably the other bands too, if he lives long enough. He's only 73, so he's not that old, but you know, you're going to see some things here about how long it's taken for some of this stuff. Okay, anyway, better move on. How many people here are familiar with the ARRL's VUCC program? Yeah, a couple of VR. It's for working grids, and the various bands, the initial total is different. 6 and 2 meters requires 100 grids, and then you get increments for 25 after that. 222, 432 is 50. and increments of 10 afterwards. 1296 and 902 are 25 and 5 after that. 2304, the initial is 10, and 3.4 gig and everything up after that is 5 grids, and then everything's increment of 5 after that. Over the 30-some years I've been on, I'm a couple confirmations short of getting my 550 sticker on 2 meters. The guy that's leading this all is K9 MRI in Indiana with over 1,100. I will never catch him. Okay, and here's just an example of grids. This is what I've got worked on too in North America. Now probably about 20%, 25% of this is EME, the rest is all other modes. This on the other, whoops, how do I back up now?
I wonder if the arrow keys will do it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. This, however, is all EME. This is what I've worked in Europe, and this gives you some idea of what you can do working EME. Again, this is over 30 years of operation, but I've probably got several hundred grids worked. There are a lot of EME operators in Europe, so that's you find out that's where most of the activity comes from, actually. And then, of course, there's the grand thing of DXCC. This is current on the ARRL's website as of, this was as of 31st. There's been 184 issued on 2 meters and 13 on 432. The stations that are listed are the guys that have the most countries worked. KB8RQ had 248. He's deceased, so he won't be going up, and I don't know that anybody will ever, there's nobody even close to that. There's some in the 150s. I don't know if anybody else is even above 200. HB9Q, you'll see his this year a little bit later. You know, he uses that on 432. Now, 1296.
This is with EME now, though?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, these, some of these, like the Europeans, they can work a lot of countries not on EME, but still, there's not enough
We work
countries
states, they can work
they
countries.
have to have some EME to do this.
Yeah.
Okay, and for us, it's like, here you can work about 3 or 4, maybe without EME. Canada, the US, and Mexico. Even Hawaii and Alaska, which are different entities, you gotta have EME to work them. 1296, the ARRL does not show anything having been issued, but if you go to this website down here, OK1KIR details his working 100 different DXCC entities. Took him 47 years. And that is as of 2014. I'm sure he's worked more since. I've worked him. He's a big, big dish and very loud. So it has been done, but I don't know whether he didn't apply to the league or just what, but he's actually done it. And I think there's guys that have on the other bands too and just haven't applied. Okay. My first attempt at EME, late May of '93, I got a phone call one night from Ron, WA6PEV. He lives out in Ridgecrest, California, about 3 hours north of LA. And he was actively pursuing 2-meter worked all states. And he says, hey, I got your name from WB0GGM over in the cities. And he said, you've got a pretty good meteor scatter station. He says, you know, I'm looking for somebody to try and run a moon bounce sked with. He said, today, at that time, there were no active stations in Wisconsin on EME, on 2 meters, and not in South Dakota either, but he said it had actually been quite a long time. He said there's actually quite a few guys that could use the state. Well, he wanted to know if I'd be interested in trying to run a sked with him on my moon set. So we went through the procedures and the exchange and stuff, and you know, I was pretty convinced there's no way in hell this is going to work, but it's like, yeah, what the heck, you know, let's try it. So Ron said, okay, I'll figure out what's the best day, and he picked the day when we were at lunar perigee, when the moon's closest to Earth, okay, which was in June. I don't know the date anymore, but the plan was to run for 1 hour from midnight to 1 a.m. Well, I'm usually in bed at this time, so I'm sitting there sending CW and listening to white noise and thinking, how in the heck am I going to stay awake for an hour? You know, 20 minutes into the sked, all of a sudden I copied him. Now, it was very weak and a lot of fading, but I managed to get his complete call twice. I think I maybe heard pieces of mine, but I never could get to the point of saying I copied my call. But hey, all of a sudden I went from being half asleep to my heart pounding and I'm wide awake thinking, holy crap, this may happen. Well, unfortunately, 40 minutes into the skid, my amplifier blew up on me. And I never did hear them after that one time, and I listened all the way out. Nothing went farther. So we touched base the next day, and Ron says he didn't hear anything. I said, well, I actually copied you. So he said, I'll see. He says, it'll work. He says, you want to try again in July? So we tried again in July, and by then I got my amplifier fixed, and neither one of us heard anything. Well, August rolls around, and August is when the Perseids meteor shower is, and that's the big one. And I managed to work 5 new states in that shower, so suddenly I'm sitting at 40 states worth. And I'm looking at this thinking, geez, you know, West Virginia and Rhode Island out east, they're workable on meteors or tropo. The rest of the states, it's like, well, you know, if you could find somebody in this part of Idaho or this extreme corner of Arizona, of course, there's nobody in those places. Otherwise, you're pretty much looking at EME, and I'm starting to think, boy, maybe it's time. Well, Ron calls me up and he says, hey, I work K1LL in Rapid City, so he says, you're it. And he wanted to send me another antenna to put the tower and phasing lines and stuff, and it's like, Ron, I says, hold up. I says, I've decided it's time to build my own array because I want to complete this too. So he says, okay. He says, if you do that, he says, I'll supply the phasing harnesses and the power divider. He says, consider it a donation to the EME community because he said, you're in need. So he did that. He says, what are you going to use for antennas? And it's like, well, I think I want to build some because I had to maintain a very tight budget here. I couldn't go break the bank. My goal was to spend less than $1,000 and much less if I could. He says, well, talk to Gerald Williamson. Gerald was the owner of Texas Towers. And he had just designed this 10-element antenna for 2 meters that was really good. And he put up this big array of them. And he says, they work. He says, talk to him. So I called him up and he says, well, he says, I sell aluminum here at Texas Towers. And he says, I've got all the other pieces you need. He says, if you're willing to buy the stuff, I'll share the plans with you. So it cost me about $200 and I bought all the aluminum for the stacking frame and the antennas. And with the help of Mark Olson, who later became N0AKC, he was a co-worker up at Cray, and he had access to the model shop. We spent our lunch breaks for the next couple of weeks building antennas and stacking frames. And like I said, the goal was to get it up in October for the first weekend of the EME contest, and because of the issues, I had to find some more tower sections, and it ended up being November. But here was the first array that I built. And trust me, when you stand there, that thing is big. I think it was like 12 or 14 feet each direction. It's a pretty good spread. It was for the 10-element Yagis. The LNA is in this box with the power divider right here to keep losses low. The 2 tower sections I got from, I can't remember his name. He's deceased now, but a local guy that had bought stuff and had extra. And actually I bought a little rotor shelf. It's about this much of the tower that came from Kenny Dix. Okay, and I used that G500. You know, I was recommended not to use that, but it's like, well, it's the only thing I could afford. So I bought one, figured we'll tough it out, and I found out shortly thereafter why. It wasn't a good idea. A ham 4 for the azimuth, and back in the shack was an old Kenwood TS520 and an old microwave modules transverter. I had used that for years, just on the other modes, and it's like, well, you use what you got. I had 100 feet of used LDF5 7/8 heliax that I had picked up at the Rochester Ham Fest a few years before this for like $10. The guy couldn't sell it, and he didn't want to take it home, and he said $10, so I took it. And that almost reached, it got about this far up on the tower and about 10 feet short of the house. So I don't know, I probably had 9913 or something on the other ends, and the receive line was really crappy stuff. I mean, I had a 100-foot piece of RG8, and I pieced a couple sections together just to get it to the shack. And first night I'm on the air, it's like, holy crap, it's like there were signals everywhere. It's like, man, EME's going to be easy. Well, I think I've never heard it like that ever again. It just was the perfect conditions that night. But also, I was really crappy at CW, which everything was done at the time, and I sat there the whole first night and was scared to death to transmit, so I just listened. And started going that way the second night, and finally it's like, you know, you spend all this time and money, it's like, you gotta call somebody. Well, okay, before we get to that, here's a picture of what the ham shack looked like back then. The trusty 520 is on the bench down there, and next to that is a Swan 6-meter radio that I picked up. That's how I started on weak signal. The azimuth and elevation controls for the moon bouncer right are here, and amplifier rack here. That's the 2-meter amplifier there, and the high voltage supply below it. And when I said that I blew the amp up in that first sked, what happened was the guy who originally built this used this really tiny squirrel cage blower. Totally inadequate, but for CW and short duration calls, it was fine. Well, the way these things are made, there's a plate line, and where the 2 tubes are, there's a hole cut in the plate line, and they solder finger stock around that to fit over the anode of the tube. That's your high voltage connection. Well, the guy, in addition to having poor airflow, he used low temp solder. And after 40 minutes of transmitting, the solder started to melt, and that spring stock went boing and contacted the back of the contacted the back of the chassis and shorted the high voltage supply to ground. So it was like a shotgun blast, and it blew out the rectifier board in the high voltage supply. So I found a much better blower, and I piped it in through that PVC piping you see. Well, the first night, like I said, I did finally get up the courage, and I managed to work Gerald, K5GW. And I said he had put up a big array, and it's like, yeah, it was big. Now you consider that my array is this much of his.
Yeah.
Gives you some idea. It was 48 Yankees. They claimed that he could hear S9 echoes off the moon with that thing, and I don't doubt it. Well, that gave me courage, and I then called W5UN and worked him. Another 48 Yagi array.
Oh my God.
These are 48 17 element Yagis.
Yeah, it is on like a train car or something, right?
Well, you see here, this is a truck chassis. That was his rotator for azimuth.
Didn't he kind of drive it around?
Well, he had an electric motor mounted on there and drove the rear end with that. So that's how he did azimuth control.
He's the only guy ever worked EME, is W5UN,
Yep.
and it sure wasn't my station.
No, it's all his. And I've got plenty of examples. And these days you see very few of these anymore in Yagi stations, especially at 2 meters, because back then it was all CW, and I tell you, it was harder than hell for me to work stuff on CW with that little array. I think I maybe made 50 contacts in the couple of years I had that up. These guys went big for a reason, so they could work everything that they could hear. You don't need that now with digital, because, I mean, hell, mine is a big station now. Okay, and then I did also manage to work DL8 DAT for my first DX, and he was just a small little 16 Yagi station. Okay. Well, I did finally manage to work Ron on New Year's Day of '94. It was, I think we got on at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and this was the first case where I realized that.
Did it start already?
Yeah.
Yeah, it started 6:30.
Came out at 6:30 we started.
Sorry for being tardy,
You haven't missed a whole lot yet. I'm talking way too much and not making progress here. But anyway, I finally worked him on New Year's Day, and that's when I found out that elevation rotor was inadequate, because it was below 0 that morning, and I went down to the shack and it was froze up, wouldn't move. Fortunately, I was close enough in elevation. I pointed off to the azimuth and I heard him echo test, and he went first, and I copied every single character he sent, and he copied everything I sent, and we finished the thing in 10 minutes. And he said, well, I'm going to call a buddy of mine in Arizona, because he's also down to Wisconsin for number 50, get him on. Okay, I gave the state out 2 more times to VE1 BVL and then WA7 LYI. He was the guy in Arizona. And after I worked him, he says, hey, I got 2 of these 8877 amplifier decks. I don't need 2, so he offered to sell me one for $500, so I bought it. Yeah, the tube itself is worth double that. Okay, the thing I wasn't prepared for when I got started in this was the amount of DX guys that I was going to, I mean, I was getting phone calls constantly from guys in Europe wanting to set up skids. And for the first year, all I did was work guys that wanted skeds for the state, and I really didn't have a chance to try and work anything else. Finally, it's over a year after, January '95, I finally managed to work Arizona, and this was 2 weeks before I worked LYI for my 42nd state. And then late that year, I managed to work Nevada during the EME contest. Now, the one thing I was going to say when I showed that map of what I had left is, see if you could guess what my last 2 states to work would be.
West Virginia.
And Rhode Island. They were the last 2. The ones I thought would be the easiest weren't. Okay, but at this point it's like, you know, this array's just too little. I can't hear enough stuff. So, '96 I tore it down and I put up 4 of the 2 M18 triple X's from M Squared. That was an $840 investment at the time. Today those antennas retail for $975 a piece. So, I wouldn't be doing this now. It was a major investment then, it would be impossible now. So anyway, there's the current array. It's been up since '96, that's what I'm still using. This has got the linear actuator elevation system that I detailed last time. And this thing worked great. I mean, EME contest prior to this with that little array, I think the best I ever did on CW was working 15 contacts during 2 weekends of the contest. This year I worked 46, so it was a big improvement. I could hear much better. Okay, and on we go. November of that year, I got Alaska, and then a month later, Oregon. And I actually had met N0AKC out at his place in Portland that summer. We were out on vacation, and he was just in the process of, he was taking a new job and going to pack up and move to Portland or to Vancouver, Washington. So it's like I got him just before he left. Okay, the next May I picked up Hawaii. And then KJ7F we ran probably a dozen times before we finally completed in October of '97. Okay, and then N7EIJ moved to Washington. I worked in there for number 48. So, yep, Rhode Island, West Virginia were the last 2. The problem was I couldn't find anybody there. There was nobody on EME in those states. Couldn't even find any guys that were willing to try and do meteors. Well, finally 2 years later, this W1FIG decides to put up an EME array, and I worked him the first time we tried. Well, it took me another 2 years before I finally got West Virginia, and that was actually done on Tropo, not on EME. We had this great big huge opening that night out to the East Coast, and one of the local guys said, "Hey, I heard West Virginia," and I'm hunting for him, and I finally tracked him down and told him, "Hey, you're state number 50?" And he goes, "Oh, I've been up on 432, and he said, "I just came back down here." Like a dummy, I didn't ask him to go to 432. To this date, I still haven't got 430, or West Virginia on 432. Okay. After that, my interest kind of waned a bit, and I still did the contest, but not as active. Well, then 2005, Justin K9MU says, "Hey," he says, "do you want to do a multi-op?" He said, "Let's try digital. That's it, just come out." He says, "That's what a lot of the guys now are running up there." He said, "I'd like to try it." So I was like, "Sure, come on over." And I think W9RAY was in on that with us too. This is what WSJT looked like back then. This was prior to FT8. You know, it's somewhat similar, but you know, the waterfall was totally different. I mean, on the waterfall today, time is in this direction and frequency is here. Well, this one, time goes this way. It starts here and it traces across, and this is where it starts seeing stuff.
It looks like the MSK 144.
It's like MSK 144, yep. That was where this came from, because well, there was a predecessor to MSK, I can't remember what it was called, but that worked like this too. And then JT44 actually was the first EME product, and that was out for a couple of years, and then he went to JT65, which is what this shows. This worked pretty good. You got the moon stuff up there, the elevation and stuff. But this was a game changer. We got on that contest and we made 95 QSOs. And we worked a guy in Poland. I found him on one of the reflectors, and he said he was hearing us. It's like, "Well, you want to run?" "Oh, I suppose we could." So we get on. He was really, really weak. but we managed to work him. Well, come to find out, his system was 4 5-element Yagis and a barefoot 746 Icon, 100 watts, and we worked him. He said, "You're the first sub-16 Yagi array I've ever worked." That was, I mean, that gave you some idea what you could suddenly do. There's no way it would have ever worked. Well, then, lo and behold, the results come out, and we end up taking first place in the 2-meter only multi-op category. Blew my mind. Never thought that would happen. It's the one and only time, and likely to be the only time I've ever finished first in a contest. The following year, we did it again and got our log thrown out because we weren't following the rules, apparently, because you weren't supposed to be going on and telling where you're calling CQ on the reflectors. And there was about a dozen of us that got our logs tossed, and I got so pissed off I shut it off, and I didn't operate EME again until 2017. And back then I decided, it's time to resurrect it. Well, WSJT is the brainchild of Joe Taylor, K1JT. I had the great pleasure of meeting him in person at the EME conference. Really super nice guy. He actually won him and some colleagues won the Nobel Prize sometime in 93 or 94 in physics.
He's pretty active on FT8.
He's very active on FT8. He's very active on EME. Less so than he used to be, but he's still on.
He's down in Florida, I think now. But, I've worked him a couple times, I think, on Chippewa maybe.
Yep. Yeah, he's very active. But he said he was the keynote speaker at the banquet. He says, "I'm going to do something I've only done once or twice before," and he pulls out his Nobel medal and sends it around to see. It's about this big around, probably weighs 2 or 3 pounds, but cooler than heck. I mean, never ever in my life did I ever expect to see something like that. That was neat. Okay, this is what WSJT looks like these days, and if you've done FT8, you're familiar with this. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on these 2 buttons down here, because those are the ones that you use on EME. And it used to be all JT65. Q65 came out, it's probably about 3-4 years ago, and other than 2 meters, it's pretty much exclusively gone to Q65 because it's got probably about 6 dB or 8 dB better ability to decode stuff. And I just want to go through some of the setup because some of this is different than what you would normally do for FT8. Here's your general screen, and the thing to note is you put in your name or your call sign and your grid square. Now for EME operating, you have to, there's 2 boxes here you got to check that you normally wouldn't. One is enable VHF and submode features. The other one is decode after EME delay. That's critical on Q65 because you can see a signal that's louder than heck, and unless you check that box, it will not decode it. So that's absolutely necessary. The other thing that gets really important here, especially when you get on the higher bands, is rig control, because we use Doppler tracking, and the computer has to have control of the radio so it can shift frequencies. So you need to go in and set that up. The drop-down menu there's probably hundreds of different radios. I'm running an IC7300 these days. So you figure out what COM port you're on, get the baud rates lined up with what's the radio set on, and then for PTT method you got to select CAT. Okay, there's one other thing I wanted to point out here, because in my last talk when I was talking about sequencers, I talked about how you got to have the delay, and if you're running a transceiver, you can run into a case where you can generate RF faster than the relays close. Well, WSJT has actually got a remedy for that. If you go to the advanced tab, way up in the upper right corner, there's this TX delay, and you can set that up, 0.1 or 0.2 seconds is adequate. You just don't want it to be 0. And what that will do is once the computer keys the radio, it will hold off generating audio tones for that delay time, which will give you plenty of time for all your relays to close so you don't start blowing preamps up and stuff. Okay, this one might be starting to get into things maybe you're less familiar with. The frequencies, the upper part of the screen is the modes and the frequencies and stuff. I think it comes set up through 2 meters. If you want to add stuff, you got to add bands. And how you do that is you go and right click in one of these boxes here someplace, and it'll come up with another window that allows you to insert stuff, and you can add bands and stuff and modes. And the advantage of that is when you add this here, when you go back to the main screen, if you go to the little pull down, and you press the pull down thing, all of those bands will show up for the various modes you have. Now the big thing here that probably nobody here has done, or very few of you, is to use the offset stuff on the bottom. And now I don't know why 60 meters is on there. That accidentally got added and not deleted, but I run, up until very recently, I've run transverters on everything 2 meters and up. And what you do is you go in and you set the frequency offset to the local oscillator frequency that's in the transverter. Now on these particular bands, I'm using a 10 meter IF. So if you take and you make it negative, and how you do this, let me go to the next screen. If you right click down here, that's the window that comes up. You select the band, and then you tell it the offset, and that's where you put in your local oscillator frequency. And the reason it's negative down here is that signifies that the frequency you're starting at minus this will give you 28 meg. And what that's really nice for, okay, here I've selected 2 meters, and this is the drop-down menu where you can select the different things, the different frequencies. You notice that, okay, it says 144, 120 is where I'm operating at. It will set the radio to 28, 120. And when you got rig control working, this little green dot will come up. And now what you can do is if you want a QSY, you just highlight that and you type in the frequency, 144, 140, return, and it'll change this and moves the radio. And it's precisely right there. That's really slick. Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out here is the astronomical data window, because you don't normally see that for FT8. That's, you go to view and select it, and that screen pops up. And that gives you all of your ASL data and stuff. Now, the one mistake I made when I clicked this and took a picture of it, it was on 80 meters. So the self-Doppler stuff is useless. But the way this works, the as and L at the very top, that's your moon elevation and azimuth, and that's based on the grid square you put into that initial setup. Okay, and if you put, let me go back, well, I guess I don't know how to go back, but if you have a station entered in the DX window on the main screen and is grid, it will then calculate where the moon is for him. Okay, as and L, and it'll give you the DX Doppler offset. Of course, this is bogus because of the fact that it's for HF. Typically, depending on the band, it'll be hundreds of hertz or maybe even several kilohertz. One thing I wanted to point out on here, see if you remember, notice on here, azimuth of the sun this day was 128.8. The moon is at 129.0. Do you remember what that signifies?
Yeah. Episode 1, you told us all about
Yeah, well, moon phase, that's new moon. Sun and the moon are very close together, and that's not a good time to operate because the sun is a very noisy. And the advantage of having the sun as an L down there is if you want to do a sun noise check, you just look what it is, move your antennas there, and see if the noise goes up. You know it's working. Okay. There's also, to get the Doppler tracking, you got to check that box, and then it expands it like this. And right now, the most common mode of operating with the offset is what's called constant frequency on the moon. Okay, what that does is it'll adjust transmit and receive frequencies up to compensate for the Doppler. Now this one here is, again, I snapped it when the moon is below the horizon, but it'll show you something that's a little more realistic. On 1296, you're seeing about 3 kcs of Doppler. And most of the guys that run CFOM transmit at 1500 hertz on the waterfall. Well, if you got an offset of 3 kcs between transmit and receive, that means you aren't going to see the received signal. It's going to be off the waterfall. So the way CFOM works is it will take the DX Dopplers, his Doppler, divide that by 2, and on if it's positive Doppler, then on receive it will shift the receive frequency up by half of that amount, and on transmit it shifts below that much. And each side, if they're on the same frequency, you'll show up exactly there. And this all keeps moving as the moon changes position, and it will completely continue to follow it. It'll automatically compensate. So you'll end up like this. You'll get everything, bam, right dead on the money where you expected. And here's an example. I think, I don't know, I didn't bring the astronomical window, so I'm not exactly sure what the base frequency was, but you can see where it's shifted. It's possible that, you know, his base could have been 47 or even 50, and it shifted that much. But you'll see that, and then when you go to transmit, if you watch the radio, it'll go this exact amount below the base. So it's really slick the way that works, and it's absolutely necessary when you start getting up, you know, especially, you know, even at 432 you can have a full KC shift. When you start getting up farther up into the spectrum, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The other thing I wanted to point out here is this is an example of an extremely strong signal. You know, the trace up there is very well defined. You see the sync pulse and all the little sparklies following it. And you know, there's 3 different stations that I've worked here. He's the current one that's viewed. He's given me a -4 and a -3. That is, I think I've only ever seen one signal on off the moon stronger. This is probably a lot more common, -20. And on 1296, I'm starting to see a lot more stuff that's in the teens. Basically, the rule of thumb is it starts becoming audible at about -18 or so. So anything that's lower than that, you'd never be able to work CW because you physically couldn't hear them. You start getting that strong, you can start hearing it in the speaker. When they're this strong, I mean, the speaker's going to vibrate. It's really, really loud. I want to show you an example in a few minutes of one that's really weak. Okay, and then one other thing that that's really changed this stuff in the last 15 years, 20 years is the internet. Back when I started on CW, we just really had gotten email. There was no real-time chat pages or anything. Well, HB9Q over in Switzerland put together this page, and you see there's different buttons up here for each band. Okay, and if you want to work 1296, you click that, and all the things here are stuff from the guys that are sitting on 1296. Over to the upper right there, where you see Mike all in red, the stations that are in that upper part of the box are people that have posted something in here in the last hour. The ones below that might still be on, might not be, but it's been over an hour since they posted, so it typically means they're not listening anymore. You put a comment or something here and hit return and it shows up. You can also do something to a specific station if you're running with them. You go up here at call and you bring down the menu and you find his call, click on it, send the message, and when it shows up on his screen it'll appear in red. So it's a hey, you know, sticks out that this is for me. Really, really handy tool. It really makes coordinating schedules so much easier.
You know, we used to just get on 10 meters and hope the band was open, you know, and that's how
Yep.
you set up your schedules.
Well, and they even had, I know there was, when I first got started, there was a weekend net on 20 meters that was run by VE7VQH, and you'd set up skeds there. And he coordinated everything, and then he'd send an email out with this data file to everybody. It's really changed.
It has.
Yep. 2019, I had started dabbling on 432 EME Moonrise stuff in 17 with single fixed Yagi, and it sort of worked. The next year I moved that and got a second one, and I put them in the middle of the 2-meter array, and it worked a little better, but it's like I really wanted to get on that band because I had built a kilowatt SSPA, one of the W6 PQLs, and so I started planning in the spring of 19, and about that time I found out there's another group that's reactivating 220 and trying to finish work all states, and I ended up getting involved, and my plans changed to add a pair of 222 antennas. They're the two outside ones that are 18 inches above the crossboom. The boxes that are below those hold some landscaping bricks as a counterweight. And then in between that, there's 4 38 element M squareds for 432. There are 13 wavelengths. After this picture was taken, I actually added a 5th that sits vertically on the boom about here. And I've got a relay up there that I can actually switch to vertical. Because the one thing I have found, stuff to Europe always seems to be between the two sides flipped. You end up doing a lot of transmitting on one and listening on the other. Okay, here's the example of a really, really weak signal. This was my 50th state on 222. It was with the N0AKC. He was a portable station. He set up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we got on at, well, it was 4 o'clock in the morning his time, 6 o'clock here, and we worked for nearly an hour before I ever saw him. He was seeing me off and on most of the morning, but minus 32. That's about that is the lowest signal that Q65 will decode. And then it took me another, what? It was after 7 a.m., so about 17 minutes later, I finally got his Rogers. That's his signal here, Rogers. And then I sent 73s, and he copied that, and we were done, and I had my worked all states on that band. Okay, I wanted to show you. Just to give you some idea, I got on 222, well, back then it was 220, in 1991. And between 91 and 2018, I worked the states in blue. A whopping 13 states. Okay, in 2019, when I started trying to actively pursue this, I got 5 new states. 3 of these, Colorado, Texas, and New Hampshire, were done on meteors. Utah and Florida were the first 2 contacts I made on off the moon. They were both made the same day. In fact, the guy in Florida was the guy I started trying to work with, N0AKC, and we became really good friends through all this. He kind of helped me get some of this stuff going, and he was running a sched with K7 ULS out in Utah that afternoon. I turned it on, and it's like, oh, there's Dave. So I got on the logger and says, I'm seeing you. So he immediately stops calling him and starts calling me, and we work, and then he calls me on the phone, and we're talking, and about 10 minutes later I look back, and K7 ULS is like, hey, where'd everybody go? And I look on the screen, and here he's decoding. So I jumped on, I worked him. Well, that was it for that year. That was in October. The following year, I managed to pick up the stuff that was in green. There was a number of other guys that I finally worked fixed stations. There was a couple of rovers that, there was a guy from Iowa that went out and ran 4 states on meteors. I think Alabama and South Carolina worked on meteors. The rest on EME, including Alaska. Things really changed in 2021. That's when all of a sudden everybody that was out there got WAS, and it's because of this guy, the KA6U EME Super Rover. He's a guy that worked for Cisco, and back in, it was probably in the mid-teens, he was doing some rare grid stuff in California, the portable setup. Well, during the pandemic, he moved to Tampa, Florida, and he started doing a little bit of stuff there, and then all of a sudden he's decided, I'm going to go out and do a great big rove and put out a whole bunch of states. Well, my buddy Dave, N0AKC, and a couple other guys found out about this, and it's like, you got to take 222 with you. So he decided to do that. And on the left is a picture of his 2Yagi 222 portable station. And notice the dish off to the side. We're going to get to that in a minute. And that's the setup in his pickup. And the frequencies that are showing up in his radios there are meteor scatter frequencies. So he did some of that. He did a lot of EME. And he ended up that first year in 2021, he went out and ran, I think it was like 20-some states, all through the Midwest and up into New England, putting everything out on 2 meters and 222. It was a blast working him. This is Peter. This shot was taken at the Central States Conference in La Crosse in 2022, and here, Peter. This is Peter Van Horn here. He's demonstrating and talking about his portable dish. That dish is a 6-foot collapsible dish made by W2HRO. It folds up like an umbrella. And he's got a patch feed on there, and he's discussing that. If you look real close, you can kind of see the elevation stuff back here on a tripod. Peter says that he's done this so many times, he can arrive on a spot in 15 minutes. He can go from parking to being on the air. It's about half an hour for the Yagis because it's a little bit more complicated to set up.
Can that stand even a 3-mile-an-hour wind though?
If you looked on it, he had weights on the bottom, but no, you got to tie him down if it's wind. He actually had the thing blow over at Central States last year.
Okay.
Did some damage to it. But to give you some idea here of how much rovers, portable stations helped me, those are the states that I worked. There's 20 of them that I worked from these guys. KA6U or the green states, he gave me 13. Mississippi and New Mexico and Nevada were all done in January of 22. During the January contest, he was driving over to K5QE's place in Texas, and he stopped and put out Mississippi, and then afterwards he drove out to New Mexico because N0AKC was down to that for number 50. It was number 49 for me. And then a couple weeks later I got Nevada. And there's the Work All State certificate. I'm number 16 on that band. That's pretty rare company.
Yeah.
Okay. If you noticed in that picture earlier, there was a dish there, an old TV Arrow dish. Well, I'd always dreamed about putting that on 23 centimeters, and it was during the fall of 2023. By this time, N0AKC had already moved and set up on there. Was operating on that band. He calls me up and he says, these guys are going to Hawaii. It was actually their second trip. They'd been out the year before. He says, they might not be going back. He says, you got to get on and work them. It's like, well, Dave, I don't have an ASL rotor. That's the biggest problem. And plus, you know, it's getting to be winter here. And well, he kept on me. He said, you got to do it. And I ended up finally then talking to Jay, N0AKC. Oh, yeah, man. He says, you got to get on. He says, get on and work us. Well, finally Dave made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. He had received a SPID ASL rotor. He had it given to him, and the guy that sent it to him shipped it in a cardboard box, and it broke one of the motors off. He had about $400 stuck in it to repair it. He said, if you reimburse me for that and the shipping to Wisconsin, he says, I'll sell it to you for that. He says, on the condition that you use it, you can't turn around and sell it. I said, done deal. But showed up in early January, and I was still thinking, it's going to be spring. But I went ahead, there was another piece that you'll see in a minute here that I ordered right away, figuring, I have it on hand, because it was coming out of Europe. Well, but middle of January it started to moderate some, and I went up and started looking, and I said, you know, maybe this is possible. The biggest issue you got with the dish was it had a polar mount, and you got to convert it to ASL. And I started looking at this, and it's like, finally dawned on, and the other problem I had, okay, the pipe that's in the ground there is 3-inch. The SPID rotor sits on a 2-inch. That's the biggest it'll accept. I started looking at this, and it's like, hey, I got a way to do this. So this is what I kept. Okay, and I built this adapter that's on the left. I came up with the idea, and my next door neighbor welded it up for me. It's a 3-inch square steel pipe that bolts into the existing part, and then there's a 7-inch long 2-inch pipe welded to the top of it. He did the welding, and here it shows with the SPID on there. It's like, okay, we're actually going somewhere here. It's like, maybe we'll pull this off. The natural aluminum stuff you see there is the part I ordered. It comes from an outfit called RF Ham Design. They're in the Netherlands. They make all kinds of stuff for, I mean, they make dish feeds. They even sell you dish packages. This is a elevation mount that they designed specifically for the SPID rotor for 3-meter dishes. The ring I also kept that off of the original dish mount. I had to modify it because there were some pieces that were welded onto these angles that stuck out the back that were bolted into that, and I had to take a angle grinder and grind the welds off and break them off, and I bought that piece. It's a 1/4-inch thick steel, the black piece, and bolted that in, and that bolted up. And about 2 weeks later, I was basically there. I still had to get all of the cables from the feed horn down around the dish. You also can't talk anymore. You can also see where I added pipes for counterweights to balance the thing out with the rotor. You know, 5 days away from when they're gonna start operating, and everything's essentially done except, yeah, you know, it's February, there's still a foot of snow on the ground, and the ground's froze, and I got no cabling from the shack out. And the shack is behind this window in the basement. It's about 170 feet away. And also a 120 watt amp, which, from the shack, by the time, even with good coax, you're gonna have nothing left at the dish, so. Plan B was to take and move the shack out to the dish.
Better field, Birch.
This was night one, I get it on the air, and I was having some issues. It turned out, I figured it out about 2 weeks later, I had wired the rotor up wrong. I had wired up the sensors wrong. Turns out there's actually 2 sets of sensors in each part of the rotor, and I had inadvertently connected both of them in, so I was getting this tremendous ground bounce. And you could go out there and it would work fine, and then you'd stop and you'd come back to move the azimuth, and the dish would turn and the display didn't follow. It just sat there and then would give you a motor error. Well, by the time you've done that, now things are out of sync. The good news was that first night was clear skies. I was able to just get behind the dish and play around, and I could find the moon. And once I found it, found signals, you just keep peeking until you know, you find another station, and as long as you keep moving it, you're fine. Managed to work 9 stations that night.
Wow.
8 new grids. I'd been on the band for 20 years. I needed 25 grids for VUCC, and I was stuck at 21, and I hadn't worked a new one in probably 7 or 8 years. That night I completed what I needed. Well, partway through this, I find out the guys in Hawaii had an amplifier failure. Weren't going to be on that night, so get done working, tear it all down, take it to the house. Next night, come up, set it all back up again. Same issues with the rotor, except it's overcast. It's like you got to find the moon. Well, there was enough breaks that after about 2 hours of screwing around, I finally managed to find it, got on it, and then again just keep moving it. And managed to work another 7 stations. No new states or grids there, but I did work my first 3DXs, and I worked a Canadian. About midnight, well, it was about 11 o'clock, I guess, N1V finally gets on the air, and all these guys start working them, and by then I've lost the moon. When I started, it was about where the dish is aimed. By now, it's down here, just about straight south. And I'm scrambling, it's like, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna miss them. Well, about midnight, it cleared off. So I was finally able to get over there and get it on the moon. It took a few tries because it was really high elevation. And all of a sudden, I decoded N1V. It's like, holy crap. So I start calling. Well, on the loggers, you're not supposed to exchange any data on contact before it's made. So when Jay would find somebody, he had this code. When he'd decode somebody, he'd go fish on. Just to let you know, I've decoded somebody. I caught one.
Wow.
Well, and I'm sitting there, well, I hope like hell it's me. Well, it turned out it was. And we completed, and I was over the moon. Well, this was at 12:30 in the morning, so it was officially March 7th, which was my birthday. So I get back to the shack, and I send Jay the picture of my setup in